A common need of today is taking the things that used to be face-to-face and shifting them to the new virtual environment. And I'm going to use an example of a project management course that used to be a one-day course, but if I was working with a client or an internal partner, how I would go about redesigning that program. So we'll walk together through this experience of trying to redesign that to a new format that makes sense and hopefully it's even better in the long run. So as I tell the story, it's going to split it into three parts. So first is just really about understanding the context of what it was and what it can be. The second is just looking at adult learners and how technology and best practices can make a better environment for them to learn. And lastly, just some examples of how I would actually go about redesigning modalities, content selection, and some of those choices we need to make if we want to have something successful. So first, let's talk about understanding the context. So if I were to go about this project, I think that some of the key questions you need to have answered are really understanding why. So things about the context of why was it a one-day event? Is because we couldn't get people off the line long enough to have them longer? Is it because there's core skills that we are going to be delivering that can be really covered within that period? What did that curriculum look like? Uh, and even things like governance questions of how did that whole enrollment process work? What systems were we using? What was the what's in it for me to get people to actually sign up in the end? But there's a whole slew of questions we'd want to really get the context on to understand what we had and also understand what those outcomes we're looking for and what they could be. So here's just a idea of some of those places we could start from. It's going to be a long dialogue. We could really spend like half a day just going through those questions and getting a good storyboard of, what are the things we want to stop, start, and continue in a program like that? What are the areas that we can redesign? Go through 5 whys and say, why did we do it that way? Well, why? To really make something that makes a lot of sense. But something that I'm going to bring up in a couple points is just talking about, what is the relevance and engagement that you were getting in those programs? A lot of times, relevance is just capturing the urgency of a need, whereas engagement is making sure that you have their attention. How do you keep their attention? And then ultimately getting better measurements, ideally more than net promoter score, but things that actually measured an outcome in the end. So one of the things that I want to understand as well as we're going into this is what is the outcome that we're trying to achieve? And if the outcome is we want people to get a PMP certification, we're probably gonna need more than a day, but really going through and understanding what we're hoping to achieve here. Also the learners. I think that a lot of these shifts towards remote, previously we'd been limited by location constraints. So as we open this up to a wider population, now we need to start understanding who are the people that we're targeting. And as we start thinking about that, some other needs can come in as well. Things like time zones, things like populations, skills, existing skills, what are their jobs today they're doing, um, regional localization challenges. So what we're doing in Europe versus what we're doing in the US might be a different story, where they have prints there. We have PMI here that we tend to use. So a lot of those sorts of things can actually cause some bigger challenges later down if we're not thinking about them and getting ahead of them. We may not be able to address them fully in the end, but at least we'll acknowledge them and hopefully be able to have a prepared response. But I think the other challenge going to a more global virtual remote format is how homogenous are these people? Because before, where we're doing it face to face, there's probably a profile that was coming up and being quickly identified and brought into these smaller settings. But when we start expanding it, the homogeny is going to go out the door, and we're going to start having these different groups with different needs. So just things that we want to think about. And also, I think that one of these areas we need to consider is the digital landscape. If you think about before, we're doing it face to face, the hardest part was getting them registered and getting them in the door, and then having a facilitator who was able to keep them uh, enthralled throughout the day and learning. Where now we need to think about all these the bests of. So things like how are we recording what's happening? And what's the learning management system or learning experience platform that we're using? What content do we have? So if it was all face to face before, there's probably very limited amounts of stuff that we can draw on for that. Whereas if we'd done something before that was a little more blended, we might have things we can pull upon, or if we're doing relationships, you can build, borrow, or buy decisions because there might be another part of the organization that has access to licenses that we can use. But the whole ecosystem needs to be considered. And these are some of the questions we'd want to have a clear understanding of as we're shifting to this virtual environment. Also, going back into the data, metrics. So do we have relationships with companies like Metrics That Matter, Qualtrics, so Adobe, uh, Watershed, all these different groups that we might have a more data analysis perspective where they can come through and we're sending the data, it's going to a data warehouse of some sort, being aggregated in multiple formats. Do we have can we do R squared analysis to actually show full correlation and causation on change, or are we just doing happy sheets where we're hoping that people say they love the experience? But we need to know how we can measure and really how we can justify return on investment and KPI, because otherwise you're just doing something for the sake of doing it. But in these integrated environments too, we also think about how are we getting everything tied together so that we can get those meaningful metrics. So I have some ideas here. Hopefully you're not limited to things like AICC and SCORM, but sometimes we are. And if that's the case, how can we maybe add a layer of measurement on top, or how do we align maybe a V1 just using those simple connections to get a proof of concept out the door, do more of an agile growth mindset where we first want to get a proof of concept out there and then start realizing what we need to measure. But all of that goes into really understanding what that digital landscape is going to be. All right, so now talked about getting those first questions out of the way. I think it's important to think about the fact that we have adult learners here. I think that's a lot of times when we've had that face-to-face environment, I hate to say it, but the word pedagogy comes to mind, where you're treating people a bit like students in a traditional classroom, where what we prefer to do is have people do more of a workshop environment where they're developing a skill based off of their existing experience. So if you followed Malcolm Knowles and you know about the concepts of self-direction, bringing in the expertise that people have, and all these different elements that really make adult learners different than people learning in more of a traditional classroom setting, it starts helping you think about how do we make this environment that benefits that ultimate learning goal. This is some general things we want to think about, but ultimately, when we're working with adult learners, we need to think about the fact that people are bringing their own models, their own heuristics to the environment. They have the experiences, and really they're coming there because they probably have a problem they're trying to solve. They're not as likely to be coming there just because they're really curious and they want to do something. If they are, they're probably not going to be as sucked in and able to leverage what's happening. But if they're coming there with a problem, with a need, and this program is going to be able to develop that skill into something that actually solves problems in the future and makes their job easier, that's where you keep an adult learner. So we want to think about those things as we go ahead and develop this program and shift it from the one-day program to the virtual setting. Some of the things that this virtual shift is not. So we're not going to do a one-to-one. We're not going to say it was a one-day face-to-face. Therefore, it's going to be a one-day virtual environment. It's a quick way to start getting some comments in the organization about how horrible this program is. So we want to avoid that. Also, it's not just about the content. We can't just put a whole bunch of videos in front of people and then have them watch them and all of a sudden expect change. There has to be something that drives the action, something that makes it more of an interactive learning experience, ideally blending in social and the people. But again, that ties into the last idea there is it's really, content is a baseline, but content plus people create change. So we have these groups where they can interact, they can help each other, they can inform each other, and they can drive each other. So that's really one of the cornerstones of shifting to this virtual environment is you're not leaving out the people. You're keeping the people, you're making them more effective and really leveraging what they do in their day-to-day to this new goal of developing a new skill. One big watch out that I really want to call out is the fact that adult learners have very little time in the business environment to actually help themselves improve a skill. So as an organization wanting to make this shift, you have to also think about how are we protecting this time for our learners. You can't just say, we're going to have you do this and do it because you'll quickly find that people are either overwhelmed and can't do it, or they're really making a lot of extra effort and they're going outside normal business hours, which if you have hourly employees, you're going to get in trouble because people are going to be logging in when they're not supposed to be. So as an organization, you need to make it important, ideally bringing in the managers and, making it clear that it's a growth mindset of the organization that we want people in there, and then the organization is going to defend this period of time for people to actually do it. It can be something as simple as putting a 30-minute block on their calendar every week, maybe on every Friday afternoon, but having it as organizationally mandated one, where the managers perhaps even being a part of it. Or there's many other ways we can approach it too, but it needs to be protected in some way. And at best, with adult learning, you can expect about 30 minutes per week per Deloitte. A lot of the research they've done has shown that, again, it's about 5 to 10 minutes per day, which aggregates to around 30 minutes per week to devote to a learning topic. So you need to be able to think in terms of these sprints that people can, either chunk it up throughout the week in these small bits that are micro, or do a sprint where they can complete that little bit or that bigger bit within a 30-minute sprint in the week. But what we want to avoid is having these 8-hour programs where someone has to manage that whole program and they can't chunk it very well. Another consideration is the fact that not all learning is either micro or macro. It really is a blend of the both. Structured content, that macro learning, according to Burson, is around 58% of all the learning that's done in an organization, and 42% is done in this micro learning context. And you see that there's different needs that both of these different types of learning address. With macro learning, it's a lot of that walking people through the process of understanding something for the first time. So if you've ever been onboarded a new organization, you'll realize that a program that's focused as a program where someone's walked through the steps and there's this big macro goal at the end is going to be a lot more successful in most cases than trying to have them watch all of these loosely connected videos that don't necessarily build towards an objective or a goal. Whereas if you have an expert, so somebody who's maybe been doing the job for years, but they need some reminders, they need some reinforcements, it's the flip of that, where micro is going to be great for them because it lets them get the right thing, the right skill for the right person at the right time. So we want to do that balance between the two, again, based upon understanding who our learners are. Quick definition provided by Burson as well about what some of those experiences can be. I like to think of micro being anything under 5 minutes, quite honestly. I know it's 2 minutes here, but some things might be a little bit longer. But it's going to be something that's very compact. It's a self-packaged module. It's going to be something like a video or an article people can read, but it's very focused on solving a specific problem or need. Versus a macro program is going to be that aggregation of everything that builds towards that ultimate goal. And it's going to be focused around, ideally bringing people together to build that overarching organization or situational need. And I think, again, just flowing off the same ideas is the fact that it's a story of the both. So a lot of times we're going to have a macro program that's walking you through the progress, but at some point it needs to transition to those micro reinforcements. And these can be things like videos that come out once a week that reinforce the skill. I've seen like hospitals do things where they have a daily question that comes to the doctors or residents who are preparing for a final exam. It can be just a quick video with some inductive learning built into it. People have to think about those experiences and they're discussed as a group. But at some point you're going from that idea of introducing this big baseline skill to reinforcing it, and then it's going to drop off, and then we're going to keep needing to rebuild the next level of that skill and ideally keeping people from dropping off into this sort of plateau or valley of just giving up and not being interested anymore. Also, there's an interesting model called the learning cluster design, which talks about sort of aggregating all these different micro modules and topics around specific learning goals. And so making sure that everything's meaningful, doing a lot of governance to make sure that people see the things and there's recommendations and AI and machine learning to really put those things in front of people at the right time. But again, it's a lot of governance, it's a lot of curation, it's a lot of things that really make sure that you're showing learners that their learning is important to you because you've given them a lot of reinforcement. All right, so the next topic that I'm going to go through is just talking about the modality that we might use, and maybe some of the content and how we'd approach something like a project management course. So first, before I get too into this, I want to call out how I think of a lot of the KPIs, key performance indicators. The first tier of KPIs that I tend to look at are what I call relevance KPIs. I think I mentioned this before, but relevance KPIs are all around getting their attention. These are the things that say, we found the learners at the right point of need, those moments that matter. And a lot of times the KPIs on this can be pretty not as meaningful, we'll say. So things that you end up seeing are things like object viewed, time spent. A lot of things honestly usually come over in SCORM because they show that people found it and interacted with it. Usually big aggregation numbers are good because it means people are going in and ideally finding something that's relevant to them. Now, as we start moving along this progression of KPIs, the next level that I go to is what I call the engagement and KPI focus here. So this tends to be more of that interactive experiences where you're focused on keeping their attention. So here, the first level, people have found what's important and they're working on it. In this next level up, we're actually having people go through these and completing, quite honestly. They're going through a module or program, they get to the end of it, and there is some measurement showing that they've done it and it was meaningful. This can be questions that come up about how they like the course, or would you recommend this course to other people? If you're doing a program that's timed, seeing how many people actually complete it on time. But these scores that actually give us some insight into what do people get out of it. Now, the top level that we all aspire to is working on getting outcomes. And these are finally today getting to the point where technology can really provide them. Because going back to our digital landscape, we're having systems that are integrated. We're getting things that are better measurements than SCORM and AICC ever could provide. So we have the XAPI, TINCAN. They're tracking all of these different elements. We're tying them back to other systems that aggregate data from multiple parts in the HRIS. And ultimately, they're giving us measurements about time to proficiency, promotions, different skill growth compared to others. So we're actually seeing outcome that's coming out of these programs as an indicator. And we're able to quite honestly justify the fact that we put money into this program and we're getting something out of it versus using hearsay or some anecdote saying that it was meaningful. So we're getting to the point today where we can actually tie things together in such a way that we really can prove that these things are happening. If I were designing something like a project management redesign, I would first look at the structure. So in a course like this, fortunately, we have a lot of body of knowledge from groups like the Project Management Institute, where I just strip down and focus on these big main topics here. But again, going back to the idea that it's going to be more than just long programmatic structure, I'd also try to use that cluster design and find different maybe topics that were related but might be different, give people some agency as far as what they might want to look into to reinforce a skill, be flexible in what correct answers are. Ideally, I'm going to tie both of these into the idea of experience. And if I was trying to build a program that was going to be targeting these project management skills, I think one of the core things I'd want to do is have people actually bring in a problem of today or a project of today that they're working on and relate everything from all of these different parts back to the idea that we want to look at something you're doing right now, because that's how you make a skill connect and that's how you make a skill grow, is by giving that foundation to grow upon. So again, it's not one and done. It's not you do one of these and everything works. It's going to be this mix of all of these different parts, and hopefully having people who are at similar parts in their need and understanding where they can help each other and they can use their experiences to grow. So if I were going about with the content selection for something like this, I would, again, I mentioned looking at some of the frameworks. We have things like the CAPM, we have PMP, we have Prince2. Um, Honestly, I wouldn't use any of those in this scenario because we're taking a one-day course, which was probably, an overview of project management. And from there, we were using that as a framework. Everything we do here is going to be too much if we're using one of those frameworks because it's going to be teaching this certification. If you remember back at Burson, certification was back on the next arc, the arc up from that learning curve. So in a case like this, I would make the assumption, hopefully correctly, that they were doing more of an intro to sort of the green belt of Six Sigma on trying to learn the new skill. So with that in mind, I'd probably look for content that was a little bit more stripped down, a little more focused on giving the basics, and then ideally have that. If there's organization who already had that, again, the build, buy, or borrow decision, I potentially try to tack on extra licenses to what they already have, or find out if they like it, or see if they want to work with us on deciding on new project content that we could look for. When I'm choosing content, I think I've mentioned some of these already, but really want to focus on high quality content. If I had to make the choice between high quality and shorter, I'd probably lean towards the quality and stuff that I can leverage versus something that might be shorter. To a degree, there's going to be degrees in all of these, depending on what that difference is. But I always want to try to get inductive learning too. I want things where people can be put in those scenarios that they can put themselves into. I want to make sure that they have options as well. So again, going to the idea of agency where people can look at things in different perspectives, where they might have visual levels, they can have text-based, they can have different texts, they have different languages. Again, I want to try to make sure that we're giving people options, but since I like to work in terms of building off of micro, where we have something that's the Lego blocks or the IKEA model, where you have all the different pieces and you're building towards this bigger solution, but you get to play with the parts and make them in different ways. So I like having those smaller pieces that we can put together in a way that makes sense for us and lets people have those sprints that they can do little bits throughout the week. Some other variables that I tend to consider. So for thinking about the blended environment, sorry, let me get this out of the way. We would want to try to take advantage of the fact that people are remote and people get the most out of the cohort and the social interactions. So whenever I'd make one of these longer courses, I don't want to also blend in those live events. I would want to try to make social as big a part as possible. I would try to make some informal spaces as well, outside of, as well as the formal spaces for people to connect. It might be using Teams or Slack for people to have discussions, as well as something like Zoom or WebEx where they have the live big formal things. I'd really want people to use the real life as much as we can. So everything that I want to do, I want to start us from the idea of we're doing something that's directly connected to what you're doing. But leverage the group, make it fun, make it relevant. I think that those are the big goals here. And ultimately it'll become engaging and bring people back as they have better outcomes. I think you saw them before where I had the macro in the middle of the and macro, micro, and experience. From a macro perspective, I would take the different elements and split them out into chunks that can be broken up. In this case, we have going all the way to 8 weeks. And with these 8 weeks, I would like to kick off with an event to recognize what we're hoping to achieve, set some expectations, have people set their own expectations about what they want to achieve. And maybe have a simple topic where we kick off that conversation. From there, we would do things like progressive knowledge checks and do more of that assessment as learning. So throughout this whole program, so people don't get to week 8 and have a test, have little things throughout the whole program to test knowledge and validate what people are learning. But also build in those team social interactions, those groups, the smaller cohorts from the bigger cohort where people can work together. But try to make things with a flow, with a structure, but also in a way that the group is able to work together. Ideally, if we get to week 8, we're connecting this back to some real project need. We actually have a capstone event where people actually show what they built. And there can be awards, there can be gamification, there can be some big what's in it for me where there's recognition where people get to meet senior leaders. But ideally, we're going to build this in a place that the learning that happened here is reinforced, recognized, and celebrated. But yeah, I think I mentioned some of these recommendations before, but it's all about keeping their time in mind and then keeping the idea that they're building connections that benefit them. All right. And I think one of the gaps that tends to happen a lot in these organizations is they build that perfect thing, but they never actually share the fact that it exists. So I would also like to think about things like learner marketing strategies. How do we create awareness initially? Things like maybe campaigns that build up interest, things to welcome people to the course, to the program. Things to keep checking their knowledge throughout the program, and also just reminders to people who might be falling behind, have that nudge. Some of the research I've done at my previous jobs have shown that when people have more of a mandatory program, those reminder emails are actually appreciated and actually improve the NPS of these programs. So you want to keep that in mind, because if people are falling behind, we want to be able to have an intervention to get them caught up, find out what's happening, and try to ultimately make sure they're successful. But I think the more we can make it an integrated part of their experience, the better it will be for them. And I think also just thinking in terms of what this environment would look like, I would try to do as much as, I've seen some LMSs, I know LMSs are getting to the point where they can do a lot of these experience layers, but oftentimes, I try to keep the learner out of an LMS as much as possible. I like to think of the LMS as a system of record where things get aggregated, or content is hosted and then everything else kind of passes through, because we'll have that integration usually with a human resource information system, the HRIS, that is creating those profiles here. But that experience layer is going to be where we have people engaging on different levels, or letting people actually have social engagements, social interactions, and engagements focused on activities, and making sure that you are having an experience that doesn't feel like compliance. Usually my recommendation is, if you have compliance, keep it in the LMS, because you don't want to create that feeling of dissonance for all of your other programs. I think that a lot of times that compliance mindset has created a sense of fear on the part of the learners, and sort of a learned inability from the learner to be willing to do more. So if you can, try to make those developmental, the what's in it for me's, keep them in a learning experience platform, and something that's more than, I know Degreed Edcasts are great for that content relevancy and getting things up, but there are the other layers of LXPs that are more of the blended environments, the Novo Eds, cross knowledge, the red vectors that actually bring people together in successful ways. So what I would ideally like to do is have the content hosted here, have all the data running through the LMS or other data warehouse systems, and keep that environment in whatever LXP system we're working in, so that people enjoy it as much as possible. But in short, that's how I would approach, from a high level, a project of this sort, where we're adapting what we had been doing on the face-to-face and then making it a successful virtual program. Some different ways. I think as we get more information, everything can grow and adapt. I like to think in terms of, let's do some sprints, let's get a proof of concept out there, let's get a working model and test it and validate it, and then build off of it. So it's usually is how I work. And if you are curious, I also have some additional articles that I've written. I just talked about the comparison of what I call a static versus a blended LXP, or LXPs, or the program platforms, as Burson calls them. An article that focuses just on giving people agency, and also another article that's focused on capturing urgency for learners and making how you can have that urgency make success. So hopefully you'll have a chance to look at some of these articles as well, and hopefully this was informing. And I'm looking forward to connecting. All right. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.